then I'm going to ask you to, okay, there we go. So I'm going to have you go, everybody, if you can go back on mute now. So Mom, if you can get yourself back on mute, Stuart and Pablo, that way we can just avoid any background noises. And then, okay, Mom, oh, there you go. All right, good. And then as we go along through the class, and participate, certainly come off mute when we're conversing. So well, welcome to everybody. It's nice that there's a variety of backgrounds here. I assume will make for interesting conversations as we go. So the subject of today's course is supposed to be the way we pray, and having to do with specifically with Jewish prayer. And I think that the way the course this year was working was that there, I guess you were supposed to have already watched the video from last year. I think it has been the process. Did anybody have the opportunity to watch this course from, I guess, from the recording? I just want to see where people are at so that I can base my conversation. No, okay. Jim, you watched it? Okay. Did anybody else? Just, you can raise your hand if you watched it. Okay. I just want to know, so if you have watched it, then I'll try not to repeat too much, and also open the conversation for those who did watch it, to begin our conversation, and begin with any thoughts or reflections, comments, or questions about what you have already viewed, and then we can go on into some new stuff. So I'll just open it there to see if those of you who did have a chance to review it, if you wanted to ask me anything or just comment on anything. And it's okay if you don't. But okay, perfect. All right, well, we'll move on. So what I'll do is we'll talk about prayer sort of in general. And then what I would like this to be would be a very interactive conversation where essentially, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to ask me questions, right? I would love to hear all of your why questions so that I can put things in perspective. I think that, some of the pieces in Judaism might be, more universal topics and shared experiences. I think that prayer, while it is a universal topic, right, everybody prays across any different faith, there are very specific Jewish ways of praying. And I think that that's what I want to get at by the end of our time today, is what makes prayer Jewish as opposed to what is prayer, right? Because anybody can pray. You don't need to be Jewish to pray. You don't need to be Catholic to pray, right? You can be just a human being that prays. And, at what point does it become Jewish? And I think that that's what I want to address, especially for those who are considering Judaism, just to know, like, what to anticipate, how is it different, how is it the same, and, and what the potential for prayer could be in your life. So let's start with that basic question, which is, why do we pray, right? I just made a blanket statement saying anybody could pray, which is true, all right? You could be any age, you could be any faith, you could be no faith, and you could still pray. So, so I'd just like to hear from you. Why do we pray? And you can come off mute if you're ready to speak and answer and participate. But that's what I want to hear in the conversation is, why do you pray? What makes you pray? I could word it that way.
Well, I think I'm gonna start since, well, actually, we pray. One of the reasons that we pray is because in the old time that we used to be the temple, used to be the sacrifice, correct? Okay. So we don't do any more sacrifice. So you're replacing that with praying.
No.
I think Cantor Melissa froze again. If she needs to step out, she'll come back. But you guys feel free to continue the conversation. Take yourself off mute. Talk amongst yourselves. Why do we pray? Don't be shy. Jim, why do we pray?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons, I think. First of all, one of them is that Hashem expects us to, and because after all, it's the only way we can communicate with him. And the other way is, I think it gives us, peace in the fact that one way I get over some of my depression or my anxiety is if I pray, and it seems to go away for a while. And then once I realize it's coming back, I do it some more. So, plus I do the 3 services a day, the Shema and the rest of them. And I really enjoy it. I never realized when I was a young man how much I was going to enjoy it, because I sure didn't in the Christian churches I went to. So, but anyway, that's where I'm at.
I'm going to try from a different device. So hang on one second.
Anybody else? Why do we pray?
I think kind of similar to what they just said. It's just kind of like reaffirming and connecting with God in that way. Like especially every day, you remind yourself like what you're doing and what your path is and why you're doing what you're doing. And it's also like, spiritually just connecting with God and the universe and things, I think.
Okay, so I'm so glad that you all were talking amongst yourselves. That's great, because I lost you. But I was trying to be on a different device, so now I'm on a different device. Hopefully this will.
Excuse me, I'm getting a lot of feedback from other devices.
Okay.
I think part of it, is the voice is reverberating from the speaker, and then I think someone might have a radio on.
Oh, I don't know. Okay, yeah, right now, Mom, can you unmute? Can you mute? Unless you were going to talk, but yeah, I think that if you could mute.
Well, I would like to say why I pray.
Yeah, go ahead.
I pray because
Jim, can we get you on mute? Sorry, Mom.
I feel close to God when I pray, and I must admit that I pray when I'm really asking God for something. I don't pray so much when I don't need him so much, but I talk to him a lot. Like if someone is going to almost run into my car, I'll look up and say, "Thank you, God." I talk to him. He's my friend.
Okay. It's interesting. I haven't heard. I didn't hear the beginning of this conversation while you were while I was connecting to different devices, but a couple of you have now since referred to God as a him, including my mom, which surprises me. But okay, so if you, I'm just curious where or why that's important. Is that important to everybody to put a gender to God?
No.
Okay. All right. So Mom and hold on a second. Mom and Jim, I need you to put yourselves on mute. It helps us avoid the background noises. Great. And I can't do it. I don't know why I can't do it. I think it's because I'm not the host. I don't know, Jackie, I don't know if you can hear me, but if you can maybe enable that so I can facilitate that. Okay. Sorry, technical difficulties of meeting on Zoom. Right. So to be clear, just regarding gender and God, generally speaking, God in the Jewish faith is not viewed in terms of gender, which is interesting because if you open up any old prayer book that's predated like 2015, it'll be gendered, right? And why is that? Is because Hebrew, just like many languages, not English, but many of our languages in the world are gendered, right? Martine, you, I assume, are a French speaker first before English. And so, of course, French is a gendered language. And just like French, Hebrew is a gendered language, right? The pencil is a female pencil. It is a her. And that's just the way that languages are. And it's not so surprising that gender made its way into the prayer book in terms of referring to God as a he, given, you know, the ancient times and patriarchal societies. So that's not so surprising. But it is important to, sort of separate the gender from God, knowing that, you know, God in the Jewish faith is not actually considered a he. But again, if you do open up prayer books from different denominations in Judaism, many different publications throughout the history, you will find, you'll find a lot of blessed are you, Lord of the universe, right? That's like a normal thing that, you know, certainly in the prayer book that I used growing up, it was gendered, right? God was he with a capital H. God was Lord with a capital L. So nowadays there is a move towards moving away from gender with God. And if you open up, the prayer books that we currently use at Beth-El have been degendered, and which is a good thing, because I think that it allows us to be distinctively Jewish. In other faiths, particularly Christianity, it might make more sense to think of God as a he, because you're bringing in the Jesus factor. There's a whole other element with that. But just to be clear, it is not a Jewish concept or thought to think of God being a he, a man. Okay. God is, in the Jewish sense, an entity. I love the way that, hang on, I'm going to use I have some resources here. The way that one of our prayer books translates, we have a blessing formula, right? The Baruch Atah Adonai, I'm sure you've all heard, right? That's what I call blessing formula. And so they translate this Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam as blessed are you, our God, sovereign of time and space, right? And then there's another prayer book that we have where God is translated in, a multitude of ways, not necessarily not necessarily as a sovereign, but like here, for example, it says, blessed are you, compassionate one, with a capital C and a capital O. There's other, and they refer to God as dear one with a capital D. Or let's find another example. This one translates it to, let's see, hang on a second. So my resources right now. Okay. The guardian, blessed are you, the guardian, our guardian. And so there's different, again, there's different ways of translating this section. But if I open up, let me look in my library here to find an old one. Okay, here. Do you remember this one? This is the prayer book that I grew up with. So this was published, it's a 1973 copyright with a 1988 printing. So let's see how they translate God here, right? See, I'm already looking, I opened up, right? They're all everything in here. Lord, 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 blessed art thou, O Lord. Right? And that's the common, blessed art thou, Lord, our God, King of the universe. And so you're not going to find that in a modern day prayer book. So this prayer book that we use at Beth-El that I'm looking at, this one, it's called Lev Shalem. So this was published in 2015, just by comparison. This is the Reconstructionist prayer book that we also use here, and this was published in 1994. But Reconstructionism, of course, has always been on the progressive end of Judaism, and so that's also not surprising. 1994, in some other publications, would have been still probably that Lord. If you open up an Orthodox prayer book that's used in an Orthodox synagogue, it's likely that you're going to still see King and He and Lord. That hasn't changed. So it's interesting how language plays a part in our perception of God, but also at the same time, it's to note that while a prayer book may gender God is in fact, really not gendered. But if you look at the Hebrew, those of you who are taking Hebrew with Dina or studying Hebrew on your own, it's hard. And Martine can relate to this because, if you have an exact translation of something, it is hard not to gender it, right? The words are Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech, okay? And Melech in Hebrew literally means king. And so it is an interesting thing about language and how it sort of shapes where we are with that. Okay. But we're moving away from that in I think in all forms of progressive Judaism. We're definitely moving away, and many have been moved away for a long time from that concept of God as man. Okay. So any other, Jim raised his hand. Is that true that Jim raised his hand?
Yes, it did. Yes, it did.
There we go.
Anyway, on the question of the word melech in Hebrew, one thing I've learned, I've mostly been hanging out with a Reconstructionist synagogue over the past year, and there seems to be like a 50-50 split now as to whether people continue using the word melech for king or ruach for spirit or something of that sort. So is this, where is this trend in other denominations?
Okay, great question. And I'll tell you, I have not actually heard of this trend. So I am definitely on the, I don't know, some other end of this trend because I don't know from it. But I mean, it seems reasonable to me. I can certainly relate to, to the idea of changing language, right? The word ruach, those of you who don't know, the word ruach means spirit or breath, soul. And so what Jim, I think, is proposing is that there's some thought that says, possibly changing the blessing formula from Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Ruach Ha'olam, I would assume is that the gist there? Okay, so the idea is that you are, I mean, in that sense, you're not only making it non-gendered, right? You're also, I mean, you're totally changing the text. So where I would sit with this, and I don't know if that's necessarily a Reconstructionist thing. I mean, we do have a lot of Reconstructionist theology here at Beth-El that we teach and maintain, along with traditional conservative Judaism and that theology. But that's not one that I'm familiar with here in this congregation. It actually sounds to me a little bit more like the what would be apparent in the humanism or renewal movements of Judaism, which I'm really not familiar with at all, I need to be honest, but it does seem like more of a universal appeal for that. I don't foresee the conservative movement, for example, changing blessing formulas. So, and when I say blessing formula, again, I'm referring to, the common words that you see in any piece of our liturgy that begins with Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Ha'olam. And then it goes on to bless something, right? There's another form of that. That's it goes on to say Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, and that's what's called a commandment blessing. meaning that the blessing is instructing you to do something, right? From law, from Torah, from the rabbinical aspect of blessing things. And so, whereas like when you make the blessing for wine, okay, you would say Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Borei Peri Hagafen, right? You're blessing the fruit of the vine. We're not commanded to bless the fruit of the vine, right? This doesn't come from the rabbis of old. So an example of what a commandment blessing would be like the commandment to bless Shabbat candles, for example, right? Then you have Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Kiddushanu B'mitzvotav Vetzivanu Lehadlik Ner Shel Shabbat. Right, to bless the Shabbat candles, because that does come from the rabbis. It comes from law, which is known in our faith as halacha. And so there's halacha, there's law that says that you are to bless the Shabbat candles. And so I don't know, changing liturgy is very, very difficult in general, and it's not unheard of. Liturgy has been changed as we have evolved as a people. If you look in a traditional prayer book that might be used in an Orthodox setting versus what we use today, right here in Beth-El, which is also a traditional prayer book, you will see some minor changes that have adapted to how we have evolved over the years in terms of changing liturgy. But it's not an easy thing to do. And I would think something as universal as like a Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam. I do not foresee a time, certainly in our lifetimes, of that changing. I'm not sure how I feel about that too. I mean, I definitely like the idea of honoring the past, even though I can continue, being progressive with other ways of prayer and other ways of being Jewish. There is a certain element of honoring the past. I would have a really tough time changing my blessing formula. Stuart's shaking his head, and he's like, yeah, I don't know about that. That would be weird. I personally would not be comfortable changing, these blessings that have been established for millennia. Right. So, okay. I don't know if that answers your question in particular, but but just to address that, some of our liturgy is, and we'll talk about this in a moment, but we'll talk about the difference between something that is called keva and something that is called kavanah, meaning something that is fixed and something that is spontaneous. So we'll talk about that in a moment. Let me get to Court's has her hand up. So let's see what she's got to say.
This is kind of a slight detour, but I've been lighting Shabbat candles for several months now, and I don't know which one you're supposed to light first and why. Does it matter? I'm sure it matters.
Okay, you mean, what do you mean which one you're supposed to light? That's
left or right,
oh,
yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
To my knowledge, I don't know of any, there might be some Jews out there that have a specific routine. I am not privy to that. I've never heard of a situation where it needs to be in a certain way. The one where it's important in terms of like how you light is actually, the holiday that we'll be celebrating soon, which is Hanukkah, and there is discussion as to the correct way to light a menorah. There's no correct way or wrong way, for that matter, to light candles. In fact, many people light different amounts of candles, different numbers of candles for Shabbat, right? Many people, there's the commandment that the minhag, the custom to light 2 candles, comes from the biblical text in Exodus that we recite on Shabbat from Vishamru. I think it comes from Exodus 31, and it says that we should keep Shabbat and that we should remember Shabbat. And so the idea, that's where the concept of 2 candles comes from, is that you've got shamor, to keep, to honor, and then zachor is to remember. And so that's where the concept of 2 candles from. But there's also a tradition where many people will essentially start with 2, and then as they grow their families, they may add more candles. I have many people in my life that I know light the number of candles that matches the number of children that they have. You know, it's not my tradition, but I'm just saying that there are different traditions with that. Whereas like with the Hanukkah candles, there was there's actually a, you know, there was actually a Mishnaic discussion amongst Rabbi Hillel and Rabbi Shammai back in the day as to, you know, which way should you do it? Should you increase the light as the holiday goes on, or should you decrease the light? And then it went into a discussion as to, do you like the first one, you know, the new candle first, or, you know, how do you do it, right? And so there is a definitive way. We ended up going with Hillel won the argument, and everybody has agreed, according to custom over the year, that we agree that we increase the light throughout the holiday. So, right, you start off with 1 plus the helper, and then it increases to 8 plus the helper throughout the holiday, and that you begin with lighting the newest night first, right? So you end up lighting your menorah from left, from left to right.
I just wanted to say about the 2 candles of Shabbat. In the household, most of the household I had been in France, we just had 1 candle. And when I came to the States, I realized we had 2. And I'm thinking, oh, really? I just never saw that before.
Yeah, well, there is another tradition. Those who observe that tradition of with adding as their families grow, I would imagine that may be like what they observe, that you, you know, like if you're a single person lighting a candle, then you would light 1, and then of course grow with a family if you, you know, are blessed to have one. But the traditional option, you know, definitively comes from that text in Exodus 31, where 1 stands for the observance of Shabbat and 1 stands for the remembrance of Shabbat. And the 2 are really different, right? Observing Shabbat and remembering Shabbat, those are different concepts. Pablo, you have your hand up.
Yes, I want to go back whatever he was talking about changing the way we pray. Well, the only difference that I know that is already in place is you have Nusach Sfard, Nusach Ashkenaz, and Nusach Sfard from the Hasid, from the Orthodox people. So in there you can see the difference. I think the Ashkenaz, they said Baruch Shomar before Odu, and the Sfardim first says Odu and then Baruch Shomar. So there's a change the way they pray, what comes first, what comes next, and also the way they pray is different because they have different prayers between the Nusach. See, there's 2 Nusach Sfard. There's the regular Nusach Sfard, there's Sfardim pray, and there's the Nusach Sfard, the Hasidim pray, and it's different too. Yeah, and you have Nusach Ashkenaz.
Yeah. So so Pablo's asking a very advanced question, which I will answer as best as I can in this setting where I think that there's actually a lot that you need to learn before you get to what Pablo's question is. But I'll try to simplify this. And this is an interesting question, especially for a group where you have people who are considering Judaism as opposed to those of us who were born into being Jewish, right? So most and again, it's an interesting. Those of you who are considering or eventually going to choose Judaism, it's always been a hot topic as to, well, are you Ashkenaz or are you Sephard? And so just a teensy bit of a background on that. So Ashkenaz is, or Ashkenazi or Ashkenazic, you may have heard different forms of that word, literally it means Germany, but it generally applies to Jews who are from the Eastern European and Central European areas of the world, okay? And so then there is also another group of Jews known as the Sephardim, or the Sephardi or Sephardic. Those are different forms of that. And those are generally applied to the Jews who originated from Spain. And of course, you know that there was a great historical situation in 1492 where the highest concentration of Jews living together, which was in Spain at the time, were suddenly dispersed. And then we go into what is called like the mass diaspora. I mean, it was a huge diaspora at that moment because all of these Jews from Spain had to go elsewhere. And so, you know, and it's an interesting thing because then the Sephardim, you know, maybe they went into places where it was traditionally Ashkenaz, and then you have like a real great blending of Judaism and you know, being concentrated in different places all throughout the world. But generally speaking, people do identify with one area where you know that your family has come from. So that's an interesting idea as to, you know, those of you who are considering Judaism, you know, are you Ashkenazi or are you Sephardic? I don't know. It's a great question to think about. Like, do you go from your you know, from your secular birth and figure out like where your family, you know, where your families are from, and is that who you are, or is it just really what you identify with here, where you're at here in, you know, in North America? Most North American Jews are Ashkenazic. And that's in part because of the, you know, the immigration that happened in the, you know, the late 1800s and early 1900s. But it is notable that the very first concentrations of Jewish communities in our country in colonial times and when we were a new country, were actually Sephardic. So the very first synagogues, congregations that existed in America were actually Sephardic congregations. And so that's so it is interesting that that American Judaism began as Sephardic, but now the, you know, overwhelming populace of American Jewry is now Ashkenazi. Okay, so that's a little bit of background to hopefully answer Pablo's question, which is that, and he used the word nusach, which is a complicated word, which we'll get in, but it has to do with the grammar and the musicality and syntax of Hebrew. And there are distinctive ways in which people from Ashkenazi backgrounds and people from Sephardic backgrounds pray. And there might be changes in liturgy depending on where you come from, okay? And so the prayers in general will look the same. The Hebrew will not change very much, but there might be different customs. And generally speaking, the order of a service will be the same. You know, I teach people of all ages, including little ones, and especially the bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah crowd. And they seem always fascinated when I tell them, if you are Jewish and you go anywhere in the world and you walk into a synagogue, I mean, it's such a cool membership card to have, because you are really like part of any community through the shared liturgy. And I would say that it doesn't matter actually if you're Sephardic or Ashkenazi, it just matters that you're Jewish. But it's an instant membership card and access to any place in the world. And I always say, like, the only difference is going to be in a siddur, in a prayer book, is on the left side of the page where you've got the translation. The right side of the page where there's the Hebrew is pretty much going to be universal. So those of my, you know, so I always, you know, they always say, well, what happens if you go to Japan? Well, it's going to look the same. Like, it's just going to be Japanese on the left-hand side. You know, it's really like, it's a fascinating thing to know that you can really open up a prayer book anywhere in the world, and for the most part, it's going to look the same. So what, you know, so while there are some liturgy changes and text changes and traditions between the two backgrounds, between Sephardic and Ashkenazic, generally speaking, the prayers are going to be the same. Now, what I mean about like liturgy changes, like, and why it's hard to change liturgy is if you take, for example, what's called the Birchot HaShachar, which are the morning blessings that we recite upon awakening every morning on a weekday or a Shabbat or a festival. It doesn't matter. We say the same blessings any morning when we wake up. And there's a series of 14 blessings. And this is where I have seen the biggest change in liturgy in my lifetime, is, you know, the traditional wording for some of them is actually shocking for some people to read it now. And then it had evolved and has changed. Let me give you an example. So I don't typically open up this old prayer book that I grew up with. My goodness, like, it's not something that I typically open up, but I'm opening it up now. Pretty cool. it still smells like it smells old. Interesting. Okay, hold on. Let me get there so that I can give you. I think that this is probably the best example for liturgical changes. Okay. Who's that? What's that? Oh, somebody's entered the waiting room. I'm going to admit them. Okay. Okay, preliminary service. Where are we? Okay. Okay. So let me give you this example here. So there's a series of 14 blessings that we recite upon awakening every single morning. And sometimes the order of them will change, but basically they say the same, but there has been some changes in the text. So let me, right. So, oh, no, this one doesn't. Wow, this was progressive. I'm surprised that that's how that's translated.
Can I?
I'm coming. Yep. Who is talking?
Well, I think I know what you mean, because like I said, I was Orthodox, and they used,
yep,
for example, a blessing says Shelo Yasani Isha.
Yeah.
So I think that's changed, correct?
Yeah, I'm getting to it right now. I've got it right here. I just had to go to a different prayer book. That's fine. So so normally we would we wake up in the morning and we would say here in our prayer book that we use today, we say Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, and we would say she'asani ben chorin or bat chorin, which means literally somebody who has who has made me free, a free person. So that you become it translates literally to son of freedom or daughter of freedom. And the original text for this was this. The original text says, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, and men would say, Shelo asani isha, which translates to, blessed are you, our God, for not having made me a woman. And then the women would say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asani kirtzono. Saying, blessed are you, God, for having made me according to his will. So that to me is the, one of the biggest pieces of liturgical changes. And now, frankly, I struggle with even changing the ben or the bat chorin, because, we live in a world where, people are, have different ideas as to what their gender is and what their sexuality is. And so for me, it's come up with my bar and bat mitzvah students who are required to recite these as part of their service and their expectations and their prayer services. And, I've had students that say, what if I don't want to say ben or bat? Which is a great and interesting question that needs to be addressed, which is currently not addressed in any prayer book that I'm aware of. And certainly not either of the prayer books that we use here today, which are already progressive prayer books, but even they don't address, somebody who is non-binary, for example. And so my answer to that would be, and again, this is still sort of gendered, but in Hebrew, you would say child of, right? And so that becomes b'nai, which is, some people would argue that b'nai is also considered a male, implication, because b'nai is the plural for sons, but it's also they, right? It's also the plural for anybody in the room. So, I have these recordings, these resources that I have for the bar and bat mitzvah students. Well, anyone can access them on the website, right? Where I have all of the text and me chanting these prayers. And I am definitely, this just came up recently, I'm definitely going to be offering a non-binary option for people who are not comfortable saying ben or bat. Now, in the prayer book that I grew up with, by the way, it just says Ben. It doesn't even give the option. I don't know what we did. I can't think back that far, but if you were in shul that day, I don't know what you said if you didn't say Ben. I mean, you can't say Ben Chorin if you're a girl. It doesn't make sense, right? So there you go. I think the other notable liturgical change has been not where something has been deleted, but where something has been added. And so the core of every prayer service that we have is known as the Amidah, or during the weekday that it would be called the Shemona Esrei. And the opening paragraph of it in a traditional context honors our ancestors, who are limited to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so it became a progressive liturgical change to, of course, add the mothers, because you didn't get the other ones without the mothers. You just didn't, right? So so they added Abraham, Isaac, Rebecca, Isaac, and Jacob, but then they also added the wives to that too. So the biggest, that's a big liturgical change, is that you have the avot, our fathers, but you also have the imahot, which are the mothers. And so you have Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. Okay, Pablo, is your hand still up from before? Or do you have a new question? You're on mute still, so I don't.
Okay.
There you go.
All right, so I have a whole book, and I'm gonna say something might be controversial, but that's the way the Orthodox pray. They say Shelo Esani Goy.
Yeah.
One of the morning blessing.
Yeah.
Is that changed also?
Yep, that has changed also. So yeah, so what he's referring to is by saying it's part of that morning blessing series that says that blesses God for not making me like other people. And so the progressive wording, the new wording that has been made, and this has been a long time, even that prayer book that I grew up with, which, is pretty traditional, but in 1973, it had already changed to be saying She'asani Yisrael, which means for making me a Jew, for making me of the people Israel, which is a much softer way of saying for not making me like other people.
What about?
But you're blessing God for the gift, right? For the privilege of being Jewish.
What about this one? Shelo Esani Obed. Do they say the same thing?
No, that one is different. Yeah, that one is different. That one is different.
Okay.
So it's interesting about the liturgical changes and how one can how one feels about it. I mean, adding, like, when I think about, for the example of adding the mothers to our daily prayers, I mean, that's I'm sure that was a big adjustment for many communities. I'll tell you, I mean, I didn't grow up with that text. I didn't learn that text and start using that text until I was an adult. So I think that's, and I'm not that old. I mean, so I just want to note that, I mean, it really is sort of a new thing to have to add the matriarchs to our to much of our liturgy, and not to all of it. I mean, but truly, I mean, it was something that I learned as an adult. It was not something that I grew up with. And there are still congregations that choose to use the original text without the matriarchs. I think it's weird, actually, that in this text, that it actually has if you look at any printing of the Amidah, which is again that core section of our prayers, it's actually organized in 2 columns, which I have to tell you, from an editorial perspective in 2015, and now it's even later than that. I hope that one day when they do future printings of it, they just choose the one with the with the matriarchs, because for me, first of all, I don't know of many conservative synagogues in the country that don't use the matriarchs in their liturgy. Secondly, it almost is like saying, it's like giving it as an option, and and our theology these days with conservative Judaism is that it shouldn't be an option. So why did they make it an option even in 2015? So I'm always bothered by that from an editorial perspective. I hope they change that in future printings. But in any case, it's almost oh, this is an afterthought. This is secondary, and it shouldn't be. So I've always been annoyed by that a little bit. But you can imagine that it is hard to change liturgy. Liturgy that has been in existence for, for thousands of years, to suddenly change it, is a big deal. And it takes, as you all know, like it takes, to make something traditional, or to make something, to make something sacrosanct. I mean, it's not an overnight process. I'm sure that you realize. So let's talk about that for a second. Let's talk about like, where did our liturgy come from, right? Where did we get a prayer book, for example? Like, who made the prayer books? Where did these prayers come from? Let me hear from you, and hear from you. Like, where do you think all of these texts came from? How do we have the prayer book? Where do we get this from? How did we start to pray? It's not written in the Torah, if you think about it, right? Those of you who are familiar with Torah text, I mean, should know that prayer, as we know it today, is 100% not in the Torah, right? There's no reference to it whatsoever. Jim earlier mentioned, he offers his prayers 3 times a day. Where did that come from? Where did the concept of having 3 prayers a day come from? Anybody? Yep, Pablo.
Well, it comes from, because when when they had the temple, they had 3 sacrifices. The morning, I think it was the Shachris, Mincha, Arbit.
Yep.
So I think that's why they replaced the sacrifice with the prayer books, because some of the prayers are related to the way the animals are sacrificed. It says Tamid, Ola Tamid, those, I can explain all those things. I'm not a rabbi, but some of them replace, and it basically explains why they used to sacrifice in that time of day, and that's why we pray the same time of the day, the way it was the sacrifice.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for a moment. Hold on a second. I switched devices, which is, I had some things that I was going to share with you, and now I have to see if it's on this device. Just give me 1 second. No. I'm afraid to go back to the other device, so I'm not. Okay, I'll just talk about it. Okay, so is everyone familiar with the Torah text that that we read about mainly in the book of Leviticus, that does this, that there's a structure for what was known as the sacrificial system? Just kind of shake your head if you know what I'm talking about, and if you don't have any idea what I'm talking about, can I see a big Okay, got it. All right, that is totally fine, but it helps me to be able to better answer this question for you. All right, so I'm going to, and please tell me also, do you have access, did you receive materials for this course? Like, are there materials that you had access to with this course, or like handouts? Yes?
Yes, lots of it.
Okay, all right, so I don't know, those of you who have them in front of you, or have access to some of the materials that were handed out. There is a handout that is called, there's a handout that's called The Last Jedi. I don't know if everybody has that one or not. If you have it, you are welcome to take that out. If not, I'll just share the idea with you. So I have this cute little text, nicely organized, called The Last Jedi. And it has to do with how things were supposed to be, and then how things had to be, and now how they are now, right? So a long time ago in a land far away, we were supposed to show our praise and gratitude to God through the sacrificial system. You can read all about this in a very detailed text in the book of Leviticus. It doesn't come in one section. It comes with reading the whole book, okay? And if you read the whole book of Leviticus, you will come up with a not so organized listing of details that surround how we prayed. And how we prayed was not at all how we prayed today, or how you think about prayer as being, right? Many of you opened our conversation today saying, I prayed to God when, when I'm feeling down. It helps me when I'm feeling depressed. It helps me when I'm feeling excited. I talk to God when I want to share something awesome, right? That's not the way that we prayed. It's not the way that we were supposed to pray. There was a list of sacrifices that we performed in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem 3 times a day, and that's where that number 3 comes from. And just like Pablo referenced, that it happened in the morning, it happened in the afternoon, and then it happened in the and then it happened. Didn't actually. The evening one was optional. That's a complicated question, but yes, there. So, but there was a morning and an afternoon, and on Shabbat and festivals there was an additional sacrifice. So sometimes there would be 3 to 4 sacrifices made per day. And all of this was done in a way that was fixed, and it was ritualistic, and it was rule bound, and it was easy because, doing the same thing over and over again like that was very easy to do, right? You get used to something. It's just like any routine that you all have now. And so that system was totally reliable. And in fact, the people didn't even do it, right? They sent the money for the priestly, group of people, for the priestly class of people known as the Kohanim, the high priest, and they took care of it, right? Super easy, right? So then what happened is that in the temple was destroyed in 70 of the Common Era, and so the building was lost. But then what happened to all of our sacrifices? We have no temple. So then what happens to the sacrificial system? Right? You can't do it there, right? Done, right? Okay. So so with the destruction of the temple came what I consider the most significant moment in Jewish history, which was actually the invention and creation of what is now known as Rabbinic Judaism. And this happened with the destruction of the temple, and it happened at a place called Yavne in the land of Israel. And it was led by a rabbi named Yochanan ben Zakkai, and he led a group of other rabbis who all came together at Yavne. And this is, in fact, where liturgy as we know it was born. And the rules that we follow today, Rabbinic Judaism, which is the Judaism that we follow today, we don't follow biblical Judaism. If we did, well, we couldn't, right? Because biblical Judaism requires that there is a holy temple, and we don't have a holy temple. The synagogue, Beth-El is not a temple in the sense where you perform sacrifices. It is a modern, it's a modern invention. Okay, and so the destruction of the temple, while sad because it completely destroyed our whole way of being up until that moment in time, it led to a new way of being Jewish. It led to liturgy that was standardized. It led to Rabbinic Judaism, which created laws, and it created a way in which that we were able to continue living. So this is where all of that was born. And so it instead of having the reliability of the sacrificial system, these rabbis created laws known as halacha, and they created these laws so that we would have rules to follow on how to be Jewish. And so that became what is known as our keva. I mentioned that word earlier. Keva means fixed, something that's fixed. And so our liturgy, when you open up a prayer book, for example, and I said earlier and nodded to this, when you go anywhere in the world and you pick up a prayer book, for the most part, it's going to look the same. That is called keva. It's our fixed liturgy. And this began around the same time with the destruction of the temple. So you had a long time ago in a land far away, right? But then you have a new hope, and the new hope is in prayer. Any Star Wars fans out there that are getting my analogies? Yeah, okay, I got some smiles, so I think that's kind of cool. I have a little boy who's obsessed with Star Wars, so I guess it's a natural thing. So the new hope becomes prayer, right? The sacrificial system and the temple is done. And the reality is that if this group of rabbis known as the Great Assembly in Yavne didn't come together to do this, well, probably the Jewish community would have died out within a generation or two. Okay. And that's the same with the Jedis, right? They would have died out if they didn't do something different. So basically they made the Torah the focus instead of the sacrifices being the focus of who we were as Jews. Torah then became our focus, the study of Torah. and then which led way to prayer and liturgy. This became something that with replacing what happened at the temple. And so instead of the sacrifices being offered 3 times a day, we would then put that into the form of personal prayer, which was then also recited 3 times a day. And that's where the concept of, you might hear Jews pray 3 times a day. And then on holidays and Shabbat, we pray 4 times a day. So this all came from the system that was set up with the sacrifices. So instead of making a sacrifice, you have a prayer service. And so it looked totally different. So then the synagogue becomes the forefront of communal gathering, right? We didn't have synagogues before that. We literally just had the temple. And the Kohanim, the high priests, that family, they acted on behalf of the people. Not anymore, okay? So that dies out, okay? And we become our own priest. Now we have festive dinners for Shabbat and for holidays. We have challah, we have wine. All of those things are to replace what we were doing in the temple. And so then you have a home and synagogue-based religion that you have, and they become the communal prayer centers. Right. So then of course, we end with prayer strikes back. Sorry, no prequels and sequels in my analogy. We just got the original, old school, right? OG. Prayer strikes back, meaning that as many of you offered in the beginning of this conversation, that we still, right, we're still praying today. So here it is, right? It's more than 2,000 years later, and we're still doing what was established at Yavna. That's why I always say, like, if there's the most significant event in our history, that was it, was that assembly at Yavna, because that establishes who we are as Jews today and how we pray. And so even, even 2,000 years later, and even if you don't pray 3 times a day, and even if you don't do it exactly the way that the rabbis dictate that you should, we're still praying. And I always, I think even, gosh, we're still in, I can't believe that I'm having this, that this session is on Zoom still, and that we're still in the midst of a pandemic. But here we are in the pandemic, and some of you are on here because you found Beth-El Tzedek, because of the pandemic, right? And that you found us. Many of you are not situated here in the Indianapolis area, and do not come in, have never maybe even been in our building. And the fact that you are able to connect to us through prayer and through this theology is amazing, right? So that even in the time of a pandemic, that Jews can be connected, or people who are interested in Judaism can be connected, which may not have happened, frankly, without a pandemic. Maybe those of you who are in Lafayette or Muncie wouldn't have found us if you weren't, shopping around to see what was out there. Still to this day, and even though we've started meeting again in person, we still open up our services by introducing ourselves and saying at Beth-El Tzedek in Indianapolis, because we get people from all over. My mom lives in Florida, and and I have family around the country, and and they all pop in, and it's an amazing situation that we have, that prayer does bring us together from there. So I just wanted to clarify that is where our prayers come from initially, okay? That they came from a system that is not in existence anymore. And while many traditional Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox Jews will still pray for the rebuilding of the temple, and so they claim, will excitedly go back to sacrificing animals at the altar to pray. Nah, I don't know about that. I don't have good, I don't put my stock in that.
Not in this century.
No, definitely not. So yeah, I don't, but I can't say that it doesn't exist. Is that what they're really praying for? I don't know. It's not the Judaism that I subscribe to, so it's hard for me to comment. But I will note that this is the way that we're at. This is what's lasted for this long, and this is where our prayers come from, and that is to say, that we do have this reliable text, and just as that sacrificial system was rule bound, our prayers are also rule bound. It's not, some would say that there is a rule and a rhyme and a reason and a way to pray. And if you do it incorrectly, then it's incorrect. And then some others would say, no, you should just pray spontaneously. That's what's called kavanah, when the prayers of your heart, take over and manage your prayers. And then many will say you got to have both. You have to have the keva and you have to have the kavanah, which is difficult. Very, very difficult. Pablo, do you still have your hand up to comment? Yeah.
Well, I want to talk about other book that people use a lot, but it's called Tahilam, Psalms, that people pray when they don't feel good or when for sick people. That's why people use. I don't know when they started. I'm kind of wondering when they started to pray Tahilam, because Tahilam, I mean, it's just, I guess,
So let's talk about that. So Pablo is bringing up what's a group of prayers known as Tahilam. That's in the Hebrew, and this though is a grouping of psalms or songs, liturgical texts. Known, so they're called the Psalms, and this is a shared book, by the way. That's a universally shared book amongst other faiths, right? It's not specific to Judaism to have the book of Psalms. By the way, neither is the Torah. It's just, it's a matter of like how you, where does the canon stop, right? We have our holy texts, our sacred texts are canonized in a certain way. That are different from from our Christian friends and from our Muslim friends. But many of these older texts are shared. It just depends on like how they're canonized and where they stop, right? So more on that another time. But the Book of Psalms is a shared book. It's a grouping of 150 psalms, which are accredited to anybody? King David. So that's where they came from. King David was known as the musician. And in fact, there's a great story. I think that it's in the prophetic book of Kings, maybe in Chronicles, but I think it's in Kings, where King Saul was having a hard time. And he was probably bipolar, actually, when you look at his history, and he was acting all wild and crazy, and he was totally out of sorts and control. And his helpers, his assistants said, find someone who plays the lyre, find someone who plays the harp, find a musician. And they found King David, and King David came to soothe him with his music. And so it's an interesting idea that music becomes therapeutic in that sense. But David is known as the psalmist. He's the one that is generally attributed to writing the book of Psalms. And the Psalms, there's 150 of them. Some of them are shorter, some of them are much longer. And they are used in many different ways. They are used to praise God. They are used to thank God. And they are used to, as therapy, as to be comforting. And so they're, some psalms are attributed to specific moments, right? Psalm 92 is known as the Psalm for Shabbat, and that's because simply at the very top, it says a Psalm for Shabbat. It's the only one in the 150 of them that says this one's for Shabbat. Some of them have like certain themes where it's very clear like why the psalm is being used. So yes, that's another part of our liturgy that that shapes our prayer and how we pray. So okay, so let's talk about what do I want to mention? Let's talk about those prayer services for a moment. So we've been talking about how we do have this structure, and again, the structure stays the same for every service. Let's just talk about like, what do you find, what is the prayer, especially for those of you who are going to be consider Judaism, and to go from whatever your background is. I don't know if you pray now, and I don't know how you grew up praying, but to go to into a Jewish service and to begin praying is going to be a totally different experience. The number one reason is because we don't even pray in English, right? We use a different language. We use our holy language of Hebrew. And so there is another learning perspective that has to do with that. Raise your hand if those of you who are studying right now to learn Hebrew, either with Dina or somebody else. Yeah, okay, good. Hebrew is an interesting language in that it is what's known as a phonetic language, meaning you can read the Hebrew without necessarily knowing what it means. This always kind of trips people up, like, whoa, well, why would I read something that I don't know what it means, right? And so that creates a burden on us to, sort of learn what it is then that you're reading and what it is that you're praying about. Thank goodness we have beautifully bound textbooks and prayer books that enable us to have both the holy text with our holy language and be able to read it in our vernacular. Many prayer services these days, especially in what's known as liberal Judaism, right? Conservative Judaism, Reconstructionist, Reform Judaism, all of these different liberal denominations all allow for moments in our prayer services that are in English, right? Because that does help you connect to the prayers. But it's a funny thing about being Jewish is that we pray in a language that we don't necessarily understand. And so it becomes our burden to know what we're praying about. When I'm teaching when I teach students, when I teach young people, I always say it's okay, like if you don't know every single word of what you're saying, but it's important to know like what it's about. And so like when I look at our prayer book that we use the Lev Shalem, for example, and we look at I don't know if any of you have one in front of you or have the PDF accessible to you, but if you look at the what is known as the Amidah, which I've referenced a couple of times, but this is the core part of every prayer service. There is a whole slew of blessings in this section. On Shabbat and festivals, you'll have a series of 7 blessings, and then during the weekday you'll have a series of 19 blessings. And I love the way that our prayer book breaks it out. I don't know if you can see, and I guess I could share screen, but it's fine. We're kind of running out of time, but it says here like at the top here, it says the first bracha, the first blessing, our ancestors. So, even if the young people or you don't know every single word in the Hebrew, that this first blessing is thematically related to our ancestors, where we came from, right? And I love the way that this is mapped out. And then if you turn the page, it gets to the second blessing and it says God's saving care. So like they're all titled in a thematic way so that, yeah, even if you don't know what the words are, every single word, the general gist of what this is about, right? Moving on, I'm looking in the Shabbat section, right? The third bracha, the third blessing is known as the Kedusha, God's holiness. And then it goes into prayers of thanksgiving and the holiness of Shabbat. And then if you are looking in a weekday section and you see the Amidah, you'll see 19 sections. There's 19 blessings. By the way, why do we have 19 during the week and only 7 on Shabbat or a festival? Anyone know? Guess?
Time.
Okay, time. Well, that's interesting that you say that, because I would argue it would be the opposite then, because on Shabbat, when we're resting, right, we got all the time in the world, right? There should be no place for us to go. And during the weekday, you're just trying to get it done quick because you got to go to work, right? Or you got to go to school. So I would argue the opposite of that, but no, it actually is not time. But that's an interesting idea. Any other thoughts, Philip?
Isn't it traditionally to allow God to rest?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I haven't heard it put that way, or if I have, I don't remember it being put that way. But the idea, I'll take it a step further, right? It has to do that we, as the prayers, are not petitioning God for anything on Shabbat or a holiday. So it's, I mean, that's a different perspective or way to think about it. So yes, I guess you're giving God off. But on the other hand, I mean, it's more just like we are concentrating our prayers to, more universal themes as opposed to the petitionary themes that you see during the weekday Amidah section. So we have 19 prayers, and within that, there are 7 that will overlap, that will be the same. But well, I shouldn't say that. There's actually 6 that are the same. There's one blessing that is the same concept, but it changes for it's called Kedushat Hayom, the holiness of the day. So if it's on Shabbat, then it's going to have Shabbat text. If it's on a holiday, it'll have a holiday text, and during the weekday, it's a different section. And so, but during that weekday, you're going to see prayers that have to do, that are thought to be petitionary. And so where you're asking for something, basically you're complaining about something that needs to be fixed in some sense. Okay. And those are absent in the, on a holiday or Shabbat, because, I like the way Philip noted that, where we're giving God off, but more so that we're thinking a little bit more universally, right? We're praying for peace. We are praying for Thanksgiving. We're honoring our ancestors. We're honoring the holiness of the day. So you're not thinking of really like the mundane pieces of, there's other ones like, during the weekday, we have a blessing for wisdom. We have a blessing for safekeeping, and so, and for healing. And so these things are like separated from our holy times. But that Amidah, those series of blessings, become our core set of prayers. And again, these were established back in that time that I was talking about, back in that, from the destruction of the temple. And probably our liturgy, it probably took about 600 years or so to really develop into the core that we have right now. It wasn't like a complete overnight process. But it was a whole, establishment. And where do the prayers come from? Like, where does this text come from? Who wrote them? I think that's a question that I get a lot from young people, is to like, what are the, like, where did the words come from? Like, who wrote the Amidah? Like, where did it come from? Does anyone have any thoughts as to where the various pieces in our prayer book come from?
Well, some of them comes from the 5 books of Moses.
Yep.
From the other books, I don't know, the Tanakh, what's called the Nevi'im and Kesuvim,
Yep.
and I guess in the rest I made it up as time goes by, I think. I don't know.
Right. So Pablo's on the right path here, right? So some of our liturgy does stem directly from the source, right? From the Torah itself. There's lots of passages that are directly from the Torah. Notably, the one that I mentioned earlier from Exodus 31, what's called the Vishamru, where it's our idea of honoring and keeping and remembering Shabbat, that comes directly from the text, and that's just part of our liturgy, right? It becomes something that comes from the text that you read in Torah also then has made its way into our that's not in our daily prayers, that because it's specifically referencing Shabbat, of course, you're actually only going to recite that on Shabbat in a Shabbat service. Something that comes directly from the text, from the Torah, that we see in every one of our prayer services is what's known as the Shema. Those of you who are considering and seeking Judaism, it will be the first words that you recite after becoming a Jew, to declare your intention of being Jewish, because the Shema is known as our declaration of faith. It encapsulates like who we are as a people. Hear, O Israel, God is one, God alone, which basically is Judaism in a nutshell. And so that passage comes directly from Torah. The passage that follows it, known as the V'ahavta, and you shall love God with all of your heart, teach it diligently, teach these words to your children, and so forth. That's also Torah based. So these prayers that you see exactly in the same form in Torah do also make their way into the liturgy of a regular prayer book. So there's, and another notable one is what's known as the Mi Chamocha, our song for freedom. Oh, hi, can you wait, hang on one second. Can you go get your brother? in class and bring him out to daddy.
Dad's like in the front of the line. He's fine.
Oh, well, he needs his sandwich and he needs his chocolate milk in the refrigerator. Sorry, I'm an Ima on the Bima. There's some Hebrew for you. Amami, Ima on the Bima, right? Bima is like our platform. There's Sadie. Everybody say hi.
Hi.
Mimi's there too.
Hi, Mimi.
honey.
I need a mask.
Okay. In my pocketbook, there's masks. Okay. So I want to wrap up in a minute, but yeah, our notable Song of Freedom, which is called the Mi Chamocha, comes directly from Exodus 15. What? I want you to go get his chocolate milk. That one looks like it's broken. Here. It's in the refrigerator, and that's his sandwich right there. Go bring it to daddy.
Just went there.
Well, then give it to Evan. So that one comes from the book of Exodus, where we've just crossed the sea from from our bondage in Egypt, and Miriam and Aaron and Moses and all the children of Israel sing together this freedom song, and it's known as in Hebrew as Shirat Hayam, or the Song of the Sea. And so this has also made its way into our daily prayers. Things that are not Torah related come from other rabbinic texts, right? You have other rabbinic passages that contribute, the rabbis contributed to this liturgy. We have texts from the Psalms. Pablo mentioned the Psalms earlier, the Tahilam. We have Psalms all throughout our services that are used all the time. If you look at the sources in any prayer book, so many of the things that we recite are actually from Psalms. And from other books. We have some sections that are coming from the prophets. And when I say the prophetical books, this is people like Isaiah or Ezekiel, Malachi. These are all ones that make their way into our liturgy, and these are also from our sacred texts. And then we have something unique to Judaism. It's called a piyut or piyutim, where you have liturgical poems. And these were also created for the prayer book. And the most famous one of all is what we recite on Friday evening, which is known as Lecha Dodi. And it's actually pretty new. It was done in the mystical city of Safat in Israel. And it was penned by Shlomo Alkabetz, and who was a famous rabbinical mystic that lived in the time, and it's only like from the 14th, or it's only from like the 15th century or something of that nature, and so it's pretty new in terms of like what made its way into our liturgy, and that's known as a piyut, a poem, a liturgical song, a religious song, a religious poem. And so that's how we get all of the different pieces of prayer in our prayer book, and where we base all of these things from. And the rabbis determined in that, sort of first 600 years after the destruction of the temple, and you'll find all of these references in what's known as the Talmud. Hopefully you've heard of the book of the Talmud, which is a sacred text, which is essentially that's the oral history, right? You've got the written history, which is in Torah, and then the oral history is the Talmud. And these are groupings of rabbis that came together, thousands of rabbis that came together to craft, again, what would become the Judaism that we follow today. So lots of different moving pieces. And I just want to make sure that you have an opportunity to ask any questions now that we haven't addressed. I hope that this was informational for you. I tried to base my answers based on where your questions were at today, as opposed to doing a set curriculum. But just know I'm always here for everybody to answer any more questions. You're welcome to reach out to me. My email and information is all on the website. If there's something that you think of later that you're like, burning desire to know about, I'm happy to talk with you more offline. If we talked about something and you really need more information, just contact me. I'm happy to help you through this, especially those of you who are, not like me and my mom and Stuart, who grew into this and who were born into it. Some of this might be like really wild and you don't get it. It's hard. I can't even imagine going into a new religion and learning from scratch how to do something. So you need, every bit of help along the way to do that. And, so I hope that I can be a resource to you, but I want to make sure that I address any questions before we all get off. And if you do need to leave right now, you're welcome to leave right now. Otherwise, I'll stay on for another moment or two to address some questions.
Hey, first of all,
Well, I'm teaching.
yeah, well, I didn't say to give us food in the middle of class.
Okay, well, because you have to go find Daddy now.
Oh.
Okay, questions.
Because I have something to do. Go, she's Evan.
Yes, I have one question. I see there are a lot of reform in conservative synagogues. They don't pray Musaf in Shabbos. Now, Musaf is
yeah. So, okay, so that's an interesting question. So he's talking about, so Pablo's asking about the service that's known as Musaf. You should have if you have the handouts that came with this section of the course, there is a go to Daddy. He's outside.
Do I go from that way?
Yeah, go find George and he'll help you. Go find him that way.
Go to the lobby.
So I can't believe this. I'm so sorry. It's the ending of Sunday school here today. So everybody's like coming to find Mama. All right, so there's a handout that's called Tefillah Vocabulary that you might have in your resources here. And if you don't have it, then you can let me know. But in here, we'll describe some different words that some of them we use today, some of them you will hear. And in there are the 4 different services. They each have names that go with that explains what they are. So we have a Shacharit, which is the morning service. Mincha is the afternoon. Mariv is the evening. And then Pablo is asking about a service called Musaf, which is it literally means additional. It means extra. And so it was an additional service that we have that coordinated to the extra sacrifice that was made in the temple on Shabbat and festival days. The reason why some liberal congregations, like in a Reform congregation or in a Reconstructionist congregation, is because, the idea and the concept of the temple in and of itself is obsolete, right? We're not, the truth is that we're not praying for its rebuilding. And so because it is such a nod to that, it has largely been, it's been effectively deleted from that liturgy. But like the full Musaf service, for example, is in our conservative text. We do here at Beth-El Tzedek, we do observe Musaf, but not actually in its entirety. We do what I would call a Zaman Musaf, like a moment of Musaf, just to acknowledge, like, this is what our ancestors do. It's just not where we're moving towards, right? We're not interested in the rebuilding of the temple in a sense, in the traditional sense, but we are acknowledging, like, yes, this is something that we do now. I will also say that on our high holy days, on Yom Kippur and on Rosh Hashanah, we do a pretty full Musaf, which is, the irony in there. But, listen, we're a progressive congregation, a liberal congregation, and that I think has evolved throughout the history. And Stuart's been a long time member of this congregation. I'm sure he's seen it go through changes, but at the same time, like, I think it's a congregation that really addresses the needs of a particular community, which I find fascinating in and of itself, right? Like, we don't do rules just to do them. We do them, I think, that really satisfy our particular community. I always say Beth-El Tzedek is a very unique congregation in terms of where it stands amongst our other sister congregations throughout the country. So there's lots of things that you can do that become traditional or very specific to your unique community, as opposed to, the way that everybody else does it. Yeah. What else? Anything else?
Well, I guess, yes, I have one other thing. I mean, I don't know if I was there a couple of times, so I'm not so sure. Do they read the entire Parsha, or they just read part of it? Because, like I said, when I was in the Orthodox community, I went all the Aliyot till Shishi, Mafter, Hamishi, Rebi. It was taking hours till they're finished,
Right. So there's so there's a lot of difference between different congregations and how they go about reading Torah on a weekly basis, or for holidays. I think that we are a good representative of what is considered traditional. We don't read the entire section of Torah for each week. We read on what's called a triennial system, meaning we read 1/3 of it each year, so that after 3 years, you've read the entire section. It's a much more efficient way of of reading Torah. And it's a much more timely, time conscious way of reading Torah, so that we're not sitting there for a long time. We do honor, though, we still honor the proper aliyot, the proper number of people who are honored. These are really, really specific questions that, you know, and I'm not sure that everybody on this call knows what some of these words are. So, you know, this is like a little bit more advanced than this overview of a class, but I'm happy to, you know, discuss all of that. But yeah, I mean, a lot of it depends on just the traditional way of observing things in your, you know, in your individual unique conversation. So I think I'm going to end today's conversation now, because I do have my daughter here and we have to run to an appointment. She is picking out her tallis actually for her upcoming bat mitzvah. So we are going to the gift shop right now to go and see what's available for her. And yeah, so but again, please feel free to contact me anytime if you have any questions. I know that this was a lot and a lot of information. So if there's something that doesn't make sense or you just need to know more on, absolutely contact me anytime. I'm very happy that everyone was able to join and participate. So thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Don't forget the recording will be on our YouTube channel.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. I really
You're very,
enjoyed it.
very welcome. Thanks, Stuart.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.